Say you are a lawyer and you are representing a client who is accused of murder, but it is not just any old murder case, it is a capital murder case, and that means that your client, if he's convicted, could be facing the death penalty. Now let's say that midway through your work on this criminal case, your boss decides to pull you off of it. Your boss says, actually, we have something else for you to work on. You can no longer work on the defense of your client. What do? What's your ethical responsibility to your client? What's your ethical responsibility as a lawyer? Do you follow your boss's orders and walk away from the work that you've done in this client's defense, thus increasing the chances that your client will die because of you leaving? Do you leave because your boss asks you to, or do you tell your boss no and do whatever you can to try to follow the case through? Now imagine that your client is this guy. This, of course, is Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the self-proclaimed mastermind of the 9/11 attacks, who is charged with 2,976 individual counts of murder. And that exact situation, that predicament I just described, is what his U.S. military lawyer is now facing. U.S. Army Major Jason Wright is a military lawyer. He's been assigned to represent accused terrorist Khalid Sheikh Mohammed because in the U.S. justice system, every defendant, no matter who he is, has the right to a defense. Major Wright was assigned by the military to this case. He's represented Khalid Sheikh Mohammed for 3 years now, but he's now being told by the U.S. Army that he can no longer serve on the defense. He needs to drop out of the case and instead return home to the U.S. in order to attend a year-long graduate course that's required of all Army JAG lawyers who are at his level. What would you do? What's your ethical and professional responsibility to a client whose defense you have been building for 3 years? That was the question facing Major Wright. Watch this.
Under Army regulation, when you're given orders to attend a course of instruction as an officer, you have 30 days to decide what to do. You can decide to accept the orders and proceed as directed, or you can decide to reject the orders. Well, Congress asked me to do a job. They asked me to represent Guantanamo Bay detainees. And I was appointed by the Chief Defense Counsel to represent Mr. Mohammed in this capital case, to represent it and see it to its conclusion. So really I had two choices. I could either voluntarily attend the graduate course or I could resign.
NBC News producer Shauna Thomas traveled to Guantanamo last week, and she spoke with Major Jason Wright, who has been facing this almost impossible dilemma. And he was assigned by the U.S. government to represent Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. The U.S. has a very rich and proud legal history of providing an honest defense to even the most unsavory defendants. Major Wright has been dutifully providing that defense. But now the U.S. government, which is not only his employer, but also the side that he's up against in this case, they are trying to pull him off the case midstream.
Whenever someone takes an obligation to represent a client, especially in a capital case, you have to see it through. And Congress envisioned, when they passed the Military Commissions Act, and they told the Military Defense Council that you have a duty to do, and your duty is to zealously defend your client. Well, when you take that obligation on, you don't take it on without seeing it to its conclusion. And so, having been on the case for several years at that point, I have both a legal and an ethical duty to see the case to its conclusion. Now, this is true irrespective of the 9/11 case. Were I representing Private John Smith in a court-martial, and let's say that was a death penalty case, I would have the same obligation to him as well to see the case to conclusion. This is a scenario that law students would face in a professional responsibility ethics class in law school. What do you do when you're faced with a conflict of interest? Do I choose to forego the interest of my client, or do I choose to fulfill the interest of another organization or entity? And so I was faced with an impossible conflict scenario.
When the Army informed Major Wright earlier this year that he needed to leave Guantanamo, leave his client, go back to the States for mandatory graduate work, sorry about that case you've been working on, he asked the Army for a deferral for a year so he could continue his work on the case. The Army had granted him that sort of deferral once before, but this time they said no. And so Major Wright faces this dilemma: accept the orders and abandon the client that he's duty-bound to serve, or quit. What would you do if it was your choice?
On 26 March of 2014, I submitted my resignation paperwork. One of the reasons I also chose to resign was that it allowed me to continue to represent my capitally charged client a little bit longer. So If I also were to accept the orders and go to the graduate course, effectively I would be off of the case in June due to all of the administrative requirements associated with moving and going to the course. Whereas by resigning, I'm able to stay in the military for an additional 6 months. As of 26 August 2014, I'm not only off of Mr. Muhammad's defense team, but I'm also kicked out of the Army.
Major Jason Wright quit. He resigned from the U.S. Army in order to stay on this case just for a few months longer, believing that was his ethical responsibility to do so. He decided to quit. He decided to leave the Army after nearly a decade of service. Major Wright's last appearance in court as a defense attorney for Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was last week. He says he will continue to work on the case for another few weeks, and then a new military attorney is said to be taking his place, although the military, as of yet, has not appointed anyone. This is just a remarkable story, not only for what it says about the legal challenges of trying to prosecute these prisoners that we've been holding, in some cases for more than a decade now, in a military tribunal system that we invented just for this purpose, but also for what it says about the dilemmas, the ethical and professional and legal dilemmas that we are putting the lawyers through, the lawyers who we have tasked as a country with representing these defendants. Amazing story, amazing sacrifice.